Thanks, Minister, for joining us this evening. I trust, Minister, like me, you're a supporter of the Natal Sharks. I know some of my colleagues here are. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to share some observations briefly, the time I have, on the findings of the Carbon Disclosure Project report this year. But I think we need to look at it in the context of the very sobering message that was portrayed in the opening video, where we saw the former Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC calling on a fundamentally different economic future. Now that's a profound challenge that he puts forward on business. And part of what we're seeking to do in our analysis of the CDP is to ask the question, the extent to which business is responding to that leadership challenge. Now, those of you that were at the launch last year in Cape Town, and I know many of you were, will probably recall that I started and ended with this slide, highlighting what I saw as some characteristics of business and political leaders that I think are essential if we're going to respond effectively to the societal challenge of climate change and to some of the other societal challenges that we face. And I'd ask you, we're not going to give the answers. We give you the data in this report to assist you to make the analysis as to whether you think South African business leaders are demonstrating these characteristics and are showing the leadership that I would suggest is required if we're going to respond to this challenge. And I don't think we should underestimate the extent to which South Africa has demonstrated this leadership in the past. I think we have a huge amount to be proud of in this country, and I do believe that we're going to see business leaders respond to that challenge, but we need to hold ourselves to account on it. What I think is clear, and I'm going to share some reflections on the last year, on what's happened since I was here last time, because I think it's been a particularly turbulent and interesting year. And that raises some interesting questions on business leadership. And I like this quote from the Chief Executive of Telefonica. Decisions where you can analyze the numbers for an answer don't need leaders. Ditto moments when everyone knows what to do. And the challenge with climate change is you can't rely on just looking at numbers. And we don't know exactly what needs to be done. And we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the year ahead. We are operating in a context of, I think, increasing turbulence, which does call on particular demands for business leaders. I think we've had a particularly turbulent year since our last launch, which was in October down in Cape Town. I think it's been an interesting year, and it's a year which raises challenges for political and business leaders. And I want us to reflect, to what extent have they demonstrated that leadership in the past year? So let's look at what happened. We wrote this report in August. My colleagues who are here did the analysis. And August was a particularly interesting month. It was a month where we saw fire, drought, and record-breaking temperatures in Russia, and as it shows here, in Finland. We saw floods in Pakistan. We saw a once-in-a-thousand-year storm in Tennessee. We saw mudslides in China, a 260-kilometer square ice sheet break off a Greenland glacier. It was a month where we began to see the market showing that same turbulence. Wheat prices hit a 22-month high. We saw commodity prices responding to that degree of uncertainty. We saw at one stage in Russia, stock and bond trading was curbed by as much as 60% following the fires outside Moscow. Unseasonal wet weather delayed the offloading of sugar from a record 122 ships in port in Brazil, causing one market analyst to suggest that weather-related issues will result in this year's worst performing commodity, sugar, to rise more than gold. So here was a month where we were really seeing weather having extreme turbulence. What was interesting, it was a month where I also had a presentation to an agricultural company in this country. I shared the platform with one of the leading climate skeptics in South Africa, also a strong spokesperson for the Free Market Foundation in this country. And what really puzzled me was, despite what was happening, there was a sense from many in the room that the physical impacts of climate change were largely not an illusion, but their sense was we need to anticipate and respond to the policy issues because there was still a degree of uncertainty around the physical impacts. And it's interesting as to what it might take to make people consider the issue. It has, I think, prompted some to do a U-turn. We saw some prominent climate skeptics make a U-turn. We saw Russian President Dmitry Medvedev who had some marvelously cynical comments, which we've quoted in here, in previous UNFCCC meetings, made this statement, which I'll leave you to read up there. Profound U-turn. We also see the skeptical environmentalist, Bjorn Lomborg, although he denies it was the U-turn, but I do believe we can say he's changed his tune on the issue of climate change. But if we go back to where we were this time last year, immediately after the CDP, we had ClimateGate, which many of you will recall. It was an issue which was latched on with great alacrity by the climate skeptics. And I think there was an increase in skepticism amongst certain business leaders, amongst the public. There's a huge array of websites. This I downloaded off denny.wordpress.com. Bizarre, this one's particularly bizarre, which is interesting to see the reflections and perceptions that are out there in terms of where the climate science is. But I do think it's fair to say we have seen, post-ClimateGate, a rise in some degree of skepticism. We then, of course, had Copenhagen, which was disappointing for many. But what I think it also showed was a rearrangement of the political processes around multilateral environmental agreements. I think a rearrangement in some respects of the world order that's happening. And I think it does, and we also saw later this year, the failure of the US Senate to reach agreement on the energy bill, described by a business person, MS Lover, president of Ceres, as a breathtaking act of historic and intergenerational irresponsibility. And I think it was profoundly worrying that we saw that happening, and that was before the elections we had in the States last year. And it prompted one business leader to say the following: if you're waiting for leadership from the Beltway denizens on climate change, settle in. Rhetoric aplenty, leadership not a whit. And I think we have reason to be concerned that we haven't seen the leadership we want from many in the political arena. Our governments have perhaps not delivered on this yet. I'm going to come to South Africa and perhaps raise a slightly different perspective on that. But I do think it raised the challenge. If political leaders aren't rising quickly enough to the challenge, what does that mean for business leaders? And are they rising to the challenge? We have Jeff Schwartz, Timberland, who made that quote. What was interesting in the run-up to that to the energy bill, was this initiative down here done by NGOs and various businesses, Timberland, Nike, and others, campaigning the Senate to take and deliver a strong climate bill. We had business leaders, they want regulatory certainty. There are many that actually want clear carbon price and so on. We have people like Richard Branson with his carbon war room. We've seen an interesting shift on Bill Gates, how he's become out as an interesting advocate on what it means in the post-carbon future. We've seen companies like Eco-Imagination understand that this is core to strategy, that there's a significant business case in finding solutions of meeting the needs of a resource-constrained future. That's what we need to see. We need to see the question in business change from not what is my sustainability strategy in the context of my business model, which I suggest many of our companies do. No longer that question. The question should be, what is our business model and our core strategy in the context of sustainability issues? And that's exactly the shift in mindset which I think the integrated reporting work is seeking to achieve. To really understand that these issues are core to strategy. They're not about being green, about being good. It's about understanding we fundamentally need to change the way in we do business. And we can't fool ourselves, as was said earlier, that all of us get it, and all the business people get it. Here are two automobile companies that evidently, or their marketing managers, fundamentally don't get it. Jeep rules apply. Yes, they did, and they got helped out by the American government because they went belly up. And I think it is interesting to reflect on where some of the US automotive sector has been on climate change issues compared to some of those that are doing considerably better. So, let's look briefly at the CDP. And I'm going to be brief because I want you guys to read what's in here, because I do believe there's a useful degree of reflection of what you've given us. So we sent you these questionnaires, they came from London, on these issues. Questions on governance, risks and opportunities, and so on. Let's reflect on the outcomes. I think first and foremost is the very high response rate by the JSE 100, 74%. Putting us as the fourth highest rate globally amongst developed and developing countries. So again, I think that shows something that South African business people can be proud of. There were certain sectors I think are worrying. Very low response rate, once again, from the property sector, which I think is disturbing when we think of the potential role they can play in addressing climate change issues. And also when one looks at the potential impact that weather disruption has, it seems bizarre that they're not more actively engaged in this issue. And also a disappointing response from a number of big companies in the food sector, particularly when you think of the susceptibility to, as we saw earlier, weather on agriculture. It's worrying that we're not seeing more active engagement in that sector. This shows you briefly the nature of the response rate, 2008 down the bottom, 2010 up at the top. What we've done this year, once again, we've given you a 4-page executive summary. I think a very useful table here, which is now color-coded, so you can see at a glance those that have answered the questionnaire, those that have answered and not made their response public, those that have declined to participate, and those from which we got no response at all, some consistently. And what I would encourage some of the companies we work with to do is, if they're your suppliers, is to ask them, why did you not participate? To engage them within your sphere of influence, or those that did, to welcome them and to thank them for having done so. So these are the respondents, both public and non-public respondents. Perhaps next year we might put up the brands of those that didn't respond, but you can have a look in here and you can see that for yourself, and feel free to challenge them on why they didn't choose to respond. Improved levels of disclosure on all issues. 94% of the responding companies are now reporting their greenhouse gas data, up from 77% 2 years ago. When we started this, out of the JC top 40, we had 50%. So we had roughly 20 companies then. We're now getting 94% of the responding companies. That's a significant shift. We're seeing, and you can see here, this diagram below from last year, the increase, the dark blue is last year's stats, the increase in reporting on Scope 1 and 2 emissions and Scope 3 emissions and on emissions intensity. We've also seen improvements in data verification and annual reporting. There is, of course, a dominance of a few large companies in terms of their Scope 1, in terms of their own direct emissions. What you see here, the blue bar at the bottom, is their global Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, so the direct emissions and those associated with electricity usage. Their South African emissions, Scope 1 and Scope 2. Then most importantly, I think, their South Africa Scope 1 emissions. So no big surprises. It's consistent with what we've seen year on year, and it's consistent with what the nature of their business model is. But I think we need to be more nuanced. What troubles me sometimes is the media sort of latch onto this and say, well, you know, Sasol is a big polluter. Well, of course they are. It's the nature of their business model which many of us benefit from. The question we've got to ask is, well, how are companies, relative to their sector, making improvements? And we have now improved data, not perfect, improved data on the emissions intensity of different companies. These aren't all here like with like, but it's a chance for us now to start having a more nuanced discussion as to how are companies doing within their sector. Is there scope for that organization to improve its performance? Let's take, for instance, Pretoria Portland Cement, PPC. You can see there what its emissions intensity factor is. Now, if you're an investor in PPC, you might be wanting to say, well, if we have, or when we have, a carbon tax, what might that mean for PPC? If here we look at what their emissions intensity factor is, what might that emissions intensity factor be of their competitors? Is it